Okay, folks, thank you very much for attending this session. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Victor Marshall. I'm your Professional Standards Coordinator, and tomorrow in the Looking After the Members session, I'll be covering some of the things, some of the reforms and how it's going to affect our members going forward. But this session is for you to have the opportunity and to understand the changes that are coming to the Independent Police Complaints Commission as a result of the legislation changes in the Policing and Crime Act. So we're delighted that Dame Owers, the chair of the IPCC, has kindly agreed to attend our conference and to tell you what changes are coming for the IPCC and maybe some thoughts about the vision of where we want to take the system next in the reforms that are coming down the line. So Dame Anne, you're very welcome.
Thanks. Just to clarify, what I was asked to do and what I will do is to say very briefly what changes are going to be happening in the complaint system itself and also what's happening to the IPCC, because obviously the two are very interconnected. Can I say first two things that won't happen? One is that there will not be a brand new complaints and discipline system constructed from the bottom up, which is constructed completely new. It is a question of tweaking the legislation we already have, so that won't be happening. And also, what won't be happening is that the IPCC is closing and being replaced with something else. What is happening is that there will be some significant changes to the complaints and discipline systems that will iron out some of the problems, will create some opportunities, but will also present some challenges. And that there will be a change to the structure and the name of the IPCC and some additional powers, but its role and its remit will remain the same. I'm very conscious in this audience that you have an interest in this subject in two ways. First of all, as people who are often responsible for professional standards departments within forces, and also as police officers who may be caught by the complaints and discipline system that we oversee. So starting with the complaint system. The complaint system is complex, bureaucratic, inflexible, and over-focused on blame. Those are my words and the IPCC's words, and not yours, although I'm sure that there's very, very few in this audience who wouldn't agree with all of those sentiments. It's therefore often slow. PSDs themselves, on average, take about 8 months to deal with a local investigation into a complaint. 9 forces take over 200 working days, and the IPCC's current average time is 236. So we're all facing a system which is taking too long. There are also some inconsistencies at the moment in the system between forces and between the forces and the IPCC. We will be producing the complaint statistics later on this month, and as ever they show huge variations between forces, some of those about different ways of dealing with complaints. Some forces will show an increase in complaints, some will show a decrease. That doesn't necessarily mean that some forces have got more dissatisfied customers than others, because some forces are dealing with some of the issues outside the formal complaint system. Some forces are prioritizing access so that the number of complainants isn't a guide. Timeliness, as I say, varies considerably between forces, and as does whether complaints are subject to local resolution procedures or local investigation procedures. Some forces deal with over 60% by way of local resolution. Some forces deal with over 60% by way of local investigation. It's difficult to believe that that reflects a different quality of complaints coming into those forces. And also in terms of when complainants appeal against local investigations, if they come to the IPCC, we're upholding about 40% of those appeals that come to us. The average in forces is 18%, but again, huge variations between some forces that uphold the same percentage as the IPCC, some that uphold none at all. So we've got a system that has a lot of problems with it. As I said, it's also a system that is focused on blame. The complaint system is seen and is presented as a gateway to the disciplinary system, rather than being something that's about service recovery, performance, systemic learning. It starts and finishes with the conduct of an individual officer, rather than the resolution of a complaint. Accountability, it seems to me, is absolutely important in the role that the IPCC has and in the role of the complaints system, but accountability can mean a lot of different things. It can mean apology, it can mean improvement and learning. It is not just about something that is about individual discipline. We're really clear about that. So against those kind of tests and problems, what's the new system going to do, and what's the renamed IPCC going to be doing? The system will be simplified. There is a simple definition of a complaint, which is in language that people can understand, which is a great mercy for those of you who've had to deal with words invented purely for the purpose of the complaint system, like disapplication, for example. A complaint will be an expression of dissatisfaction, pure and simple. And therefore, this will take away all this thing about should it be recorded, should it not be recorded. There will be three sorts of complaints handling. First of all, there'll be a flexibility to resolve some complaints completely outside the formal system. Forces will be able to handle the complaint in such other matter as they consider appropriate, with a view to resolving the complaint to the complainant's satisfaction. So there will be that space to do what most complaint systems do, which is try to resolve a complaint in the most appropriate way. However, it'll have to revert to the formal system if the complainant insists and is not satisfied, or if there is a possibility from the face of the complaint or any work that's done on it that there could be disciplinary, criminal proceedings or a breach of Articles 2 or 3. So if those happen, it must go, either of those things happen, it must go into the formal system. But once it's inside the formal system, there is also, it doesn't have to be investigated, and there will be a flexibility in deciding how to deal with it. The authority will be able to handle the complaint in such reasonable and proportionate manner as it determines. So some can be dealt with without investigation, and some will be investigated, either because it's thought the right way to go about it, or again, if inquiries into the complaint or the complaint itself show that there is an indication that there may be a disciplinary offence, a criminal offence, or an Article 2.3 infringement. So forces will have more flexibility than now to decide how to deal with things. There will only also be one appeal, rather than 4 or 5 different appeals, and all of you will be very familiar with the appeals roundabout, whereby there's appeals against one thing, there's appeals against one officer that then become appeals about the higher grade officer, and so on and so forth. There's an attempt to stop that. There will only be one appeal. It will always be to an independent body. It will either be to the Police and Crime Commissioner, or it will be to the IPCC. We're not yet sure, it's not yet clear what the test will be. At the IPCC, I think we're assuming it will be the same test as previously, which is a test of whether this could be disciplinary or criminal, but we don't yet know. So it will always go to an independent body, but it will be what's called a review. And that review will be able to make a determination about the outcome, not the process of the complaint, whether the outcome is reasonable and proportionate. The complaint can be determined and remedies can be recommended. So the idea is to produce a finality in the system, a simplification and a finality in the system that we don't have. So that's the new complaint system as it's designed to work. What about the IPCC? Currently at the IPCC, we've got, as those of you familiar with engaging with us will be aware, we've got 2 separate strands of decision-making and accountability. We have the commissioners who have responsibility for certain decisions and also act as the board of the IPCC, and you also have got the executive reporting up to the chief executive officer, which includes all our investigators, our caseworkers dealing with appeals, and so on. There is, therefore, sometimes a confusion about whose decision it is. There is a difference between commissioners who have to make certain decisions but don't have line management responsibilities, and those who do have line management responsibilities and commission. It's a system that I think worked reasonably well when the IPCC was relatively small and dealing with a relatively small number of cases. It's not, as we ourselves said to the Home Secretary, a system that we think can operate effectively in an organisation that is now an organisation of 1,000 people doing 650 independent investigations a year. So we ourselves proposed to the Home Secretary that the governance structure of the organisation needed to change. And what will happen is there will be a single person who will be responsible for the work of the IPCC, who will be called a Director General. Under them, there will be deputies, but there will also then be regional directors, and the regional director and a national director for Wales, and those people will be responsible for the work of the Independent Office of Police Conduct, as it will be called, in those regions and nations. So there will be, if you like, a single point of contact at a senior level of somebody who in each region, or in the case of Wales Nation, is responsible for the work of the IPCC. The Director General themselves will be a Crown appointment and cannot have worked for the police. They will have the power to bar certain other roles as not being available to ex-police officers, and that will be a decision they will have to make. There'll be a unitary board with a majority of non-executives, and, as I say, a new name, because it's not a commission anymore, and so it will be called the Independent Office of Police Conduct. There will be some additional powers for the IPCC. We will be able to, the new organisation will be able to investigate cases on its own initiative rather than having to wait for a referral from a force, because at the moment it looks very odd if something happens and there is something that clearly needs to be investigated, and we have to say we have to wait for the force to record and refer. There'll only be two sorts of investigation that the IOPC will be able to do, either an independent investigation or what's called a directed investigation, where there will be clear direction and control and using police resources. And it's envisaged that will be used for example, investigations that require a lot of covert work, or ones where there's a parallel criminal investigation going on. The process after the finding of a case to answer for discipline will be simplified. There won't be the toing and froing between the force and the IPCC that there is now. It will be the decision of the IOPC, which will take representations from a force, but will make the decision, taking into account the views of the force. The organisation will have presenting powers at tribunals. It's not yet clear exactly how that will operate, and I can answer questions about that if people want to give them. There will be a duty to investigate allegations against chief officers, and again, I hope that will be clarified in regulations so that we can, as we do at present, just ask for no further action in cases that are trivial and are not conduct matters at all. There will, as you're aware, will be super complaints, which certain designated bodies will be able to make. And the test of that is that any feature or features appear to be significantly harming the interests of the public. That will be coordinated through HMIC, but there'll be a sort of triage process with ourselves, the College of Policing and HMIC, to see how that might, and by which organisation that might most appropriately be dealt with. And you will also be aware of the proposals for whistleblowing. The original drafting, we thought, risked putting the IOPC too much in an employment-related space, and that's now been refined to give discretion and an ability to decide whether this is actually a conduct matter. There are some issues, a lot of issues, that will fall to be dealt with by regulations, and we've been discussing with Vic, with other colleagues, how those regulations might work. I think we all want them to be as light touch as possible. At the moment, we have some extraordinarily complex regulations, not just in terms of complaints, but also in terms of performance, in terms of discipline. The changes about how to deal with retired and resigned officers should be coming in very soon, and that will then create the situation where if someone resigns or retires after an allegation or within 12 months of leaving, the IPCC or the force can determine to investigate within that time limit. It's anticipated that will only be for gross misconduct. We're looking, as I say, to see what the test will be for which appeals go to PCCs and which come to the IPCC. We're looking to define the presenting powers. We would like a duty of cooperation for police witnesses, only witnesses, to allow for swifter interviews, swifter gathering of all the information we need. And we're also, obviously, in a separate level, waiting for the Home Secretary's response to our draft guidance on post-incident procedures, which also covers that. We're also, I think, expecting and actually hoping that the case to answer test will be looked at the moment due to court judgments, and that many of you may have seen the letter I wrote to Chief Constables. That has been defined as a low threshold, and I think we all think that there needs to be, we need to look at that and see how it might be defined. It should not be and cannot be, because of the legislation, as high as the CPS test. But I think we need to have a look at how that might best be defined. So, in order to give you time for questions, I want to sort of move on to what for me are the issues for all of us, including force PSDs as well as the IPCC, in terms of where we are and where we want to be. We haven't, as I said, started from scratch and rebuilt the complaints, the discipline systems from the beginning. We have still got a system, and we've still got a piece of legislation which defines misconduct as any breach of standards. And that has not been altered. So what we've got provides some opportunities for a different approach, but it will require a change of culture. And that change of culture, I think, I'm aware of the question given to the policing minister earlier about the IPCC being punitive. I don't think for myself that is just a culture within the IPCC. I think this is a culture that is through policing, of how you deal with things. We have to think, why was it that the Taylor reforms never landed? And I have said in many places that this is about culture, that actually culture eats process for breakfast. That unless you are really clear about what you want to do and where you want to get to, we can keep on changing laws and regulations, but we won't necessarily get to where we need to be. And one of the key questions is how you balance accountability, consistency, and flexibility. Where things are dealt with outside the system, which must be right for low-level complaints, which are essentially about service recovery, how do you monitor and identify patterns that are emerging? I've often said that a complaint system for managers should be a bit of a canary in the mine. In other words, that if something is happening, if there are certain issues that keep on emerging, certain officers where things keep on being said, certain communities or individuals who seem to be complaining more than others. This, for me, raises management questions that you need to be alert to. And I think one of the problems about a system which has been so blame-focused is that the immediate reaction is defensiveness rather than actually systemic learning. I don't think it's just about individual learning, it's about systemic learning. How do you ensure that the right judgments are made about whether an investigation is actually needed, because this is a matter which could be disciplinary or could be criminal? When we look at appeals against local resolution decisions, of which we get relatively few these days because of the change in system, we find in a troubling number of cases that these should have been investigated, that they were not appropriate for local resolution. So where those decisions are made, where will the accountability be on that? And also, where are the conversations happening with the public on how they can have confidence in the system? We're having a lot of discussions ourselves, internally, within our own organisations, with the Home Office. Where is the debate going with the public about what this system is and what it's meant to be? Because unless the public buy into it too, we won't have the success that we need. There's also the system. The new system will reduce some processes, some inconsistencies, but there will be others. For example, the role of the Police and Crime Commissioner. Police and crime commissioners will have a mandatory role in relation to appeals and an explicit statutory requirement to hold the Chief Constable to account for complaints handling. But they will be able to decide whether they do the informal handling of complaints outside the system, whether they're responsible for recording decisions, or whether they're the point of contact for complainants when the force records and handles matters. Different PCCs, possibly even different PCCs that share a PSD, will be making decisions about which of those options they want. I think the majority are deciding to go for appeals first and then see what happens. But some are already doing handling outside the system and undoubtedly will continue to do it. I don't think the aim of any system should be a rigid consistency, but I think there will be issues of fairness as between different methods, and also ensuring fairness in the way that complaints are dealt with. There also, and I've mentioned performance before, it's clear that there should be things that are dealt with by performance. How far do the performance regulations inhibit forces from using them as much as they should? A lot of talk about the concepts of blame and learning, and we and I have said a lot about that. There's a lot of talk about the safe space concept and the idea of learning from failure. There will be a safe space in the new system, which will be the resolution of lower level complaints where statements given in that process will not be admissible if they go to formal proceedings. That's helpful. But it won't be true in investigations. I think that in all systems, and the airline industry has been mentioned, and also the new Health Service Investigation Bureau, there are issues which go to seriousness, which have to be dealt with on a formal level. And I think this will be the same in the system at the moment. Issues of performance versus conduct. As I've said, there will still be a definition of misconduct as a breach of standards. And that does start creating some issues around what's performance and what's conduct. The blame culture, as I've said, is not just the IPCC. We've had discussions, for example, quite public discussions, as you'll have heard, with firearms officers about the way that we deal with firearms incidents. We point out in the great majority of cases where we've investigated firearms incidents, we've never served a notice on any of the principal officers in those cases, and that remains the case. Those of you with longer memories even than me may recall that before the IPCC was created, when the Police Complaints Authority used to supervise investigations of these things, every firearms fatality was investigated as if it were a homicide. We don't do that. We haven't done that since the IPCC was created. So there is a different system, and there is also a reluctance sometimes from forces themselves to use the performance rather than the conduct route. There's a great quote from Chip Chapman's report into police discipline systems, where he says forces tend to go straight into the use of the conduct regulations rather than tackle performance issues. Supervisors will default to conduct as they're then able to pass the problem to someone else to deal with. Unless we get the performance bit right, and it's really right, and it is robust, and it is properly about learning and training and support, that's got to be part of the discussion. It's got to be part of the discussion with the public, because the public have got to trust that it is more than doing nothing or just criticizing somebody. So if we're defining what counts as genuine as misconduct, I think we need to look at impact. It's not just about whether it's deliberate or not. That's clear from some recent legal judgments. But it must be serious enough to be an issue that is an issue of conduct. We need to simplify and properly use the performance regulations and the learning and training. And we also, for me, need to look at systemic failings. Too many of our investigations, and I've said this before, are into individual officers rather than looking at actually how it got that way. Why was it that that person in that situation did that? And I've said many times, and I say it again as long as I remain chair of the IPCC, I am troubled when sometimes I feel that we are investigating the person who was holding the parcel when the music stopped. I want to know why the music was playing like that. We need, I think, the flexibility within the system to look beyond the incident itself. I'm not saying that there should not be blame for officers who clearly misconduct themselves or who do things in a way that because of their own actions result in things happening that should not be happening. But we also need to look at leadership and management, and we need the IOPC to be able to do that. And where the IPCC has been able to do that, I think that has resulted in some really positive work. I'm looking, for example, at the way that the Ebrahimi case exposed the way that race hate issues were dealt with. Some of the investigations into domestic violence have greatly improved the way forces deal with that. The fact that we now have fewer than half the number of deaths in custody that we did before the IPCC was set up is about a relationship between the IPCC and the service, where the service has learnt from investigations and safer detention guidelines have been produced. So I think we can do that, and we need to do it. So for me, there are three things that I just want to leave you with. One is about accountability. The service must be accountable. You must be accountable for the powers that you have and that you need to use. But as I said, accountability can take a lot of different forms, and we must have a system that recognizes all of them. And that implies openness and transparency and not a sense of defensiveness. We need the right culture, that complaints are important management information, that there's less defensiveness about them, and also just in the same way that the service, that within the service there needs to be not too much of a focus on blame. The cases that I've seen that have gone wrong have been sometimes where people have blamed the complainant, or indeed have judged the complainant rather than looking at the complaint. So that's a really important culture. And finally, as I said, public confidence. At the moment, it's a conversation between those of us who are obsessed with the Police Reform Act, bureaucrats, lawyers, the service, and the IPCC. Because there was no longer-term project, we haven't engaged others in that conversation. We need to draw the public into this, and we need the public to have confidence in the system that comes out, as well as the service having confidence in it.